In this video, we will continue covering chapter 8.5 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. More precisely, we will show how to use createQuery method to create select statements of JPQL that return different values, entity, array of properties, or just a scalar. If we want to return an entity from JPQL, then our select statement will start like this. If we want to return array of entity properties from JPQL select statement, then our select statement might look like this, where we specify properties that we are interested in instead of returning the complete entity. And if we want to return a scalar from JPQL select statement, we can then use following select statement that only specifies a single property that needs to be returned, and in this case this would be the age integer. As in the previous example, since JPQL doesn't support insert statement, we will use native query inside loadPerson's Java object to insert our test record into the database that will then be used with these select statements. So this is our loadPerson's object that implements command line runner and which has this run method which will be executed as soon as we start our application, and then inside this run method we will insert this single person record with following parameters: name John and age 20. This is how our application properties file will look like. We will have these properties that configure H2 database, and then following properties for configuring Hibernate to drop and recreate all the tables every time our application is started. And this is how our person entity will look like. It will only have these properties: ID, name, and age of the person. So the main focus of this tutorial is this controller, which will have 3 endpoints, and each endpoint will demonstrate how to create JPQL select statement that returns either entity, object array, or scalar. These endpoints will then be accessed by using these URLs. So the endpoint that returns an entity will display the returned entity as a JSON string. Endpoint that returns object array of selected properties will display those properties as a list, and our last endpoint that contains a select statement that returns a single property will simply return the value of that property. So this is how our controller will look like. So we will have this first method which demonstrates how to create a JPQL select statement that returns a person entity. So to do so, we use createQuery, and as a first parameter we give it this select statement, but as a second parameter we specified what kind of class the statement needs to return. And after setting the named parameters, we can then execute that query in order to select the entity from the database by calling getSingleResult and then casting the result to the person entity, and then this endpoint will return this person entity, and we will be able to see that person entity as a JSON string like shown here. So this is how we can create a JPQL select statement that returns a person entity. So such statement should start like this, so that the whole person entity is then later being returned. Our second endpoint will show how to create a JPQL select statement that only returns specific properties from the entity. by specifying those properties after the select keyword. We can then create our select statement, but in this case we don't need the second parameter to specify the type of class that is being returned, because by default JPQL will return an array of object, or in this case array that will contain these properties: string and integer. After setting the parameters of our JPQL select statement, we can execute our select statement by calling getSingleResult and then casting the result as object array, and then our endpoint will simply return that object array back to us, which will be displayed in a browser as a list of properties. And our last endpoint will only return a single property from the entity. So this is how we would define it. And after we create the query and define the named parameters, we can execute the query in the same way by calling getSingleRecord and then cast the result into the integer. And our endpoint will then return that value back to us. So in our browser, we will see the value of the age integer. Now we can test this application by using Google Chrome web browser and entering URL of the first endpoint. Since this endpoint returns the complete entity, we will see that returned entity as a JSON string. So this is our first endpoint that selects a complete entity and then returns that entity from the endpoint. We can now use this URL to call the second endpoint, which will return only the specific properties from the entity and not the complete entity. And these properties will then be returned as an object array and then show in the browser as a list of objects. So this is our second entity, which endpoint, which returns only specified properties, and these are then returned as object array from the endpoint. And in our controller we can then see that like this. And then we can call this URL to call the third and the last endpoint that executes JPQL select statement that only returns a single property and age of the entity. And then this property will be returned by simply returning its value. So this is this last endpoint that executes select statement that returns just a single property. So by default, when we execute that query, it will return a single value, an integer, and store it in this variable, which is then returned from the endpoint. And this is why in our web browser we simply see the value of that single property age integer. So in this tutorial we have seen how we can create different JPQL select statements that return different things, either complete entity, if we specify that a select statement should return entity, or a list of properties if we specify that we are only interested in specific properties and not in the complete entity, or how to return a scalar if we specify that we are just interested in a single property. And this way we can reduce the time that is needed for data to be fetched if we only specify that we don't want the complete entity but only some of the properties.